There's something people feel, but almost no one can explain. It shows up between two people, sometimes instantly, sometimes slowly, and suddenly the space between them starts to feel different. Not louder, not obvious, just different. A look that lasts half a second longer. A pause that feels slightly heavier than normal. A silence that doesn't feel empty anymore, and in that moment, something starts building without permission. You can't see it clearly, you can't prove it, but you can feel it shifting, and the strange part is, the more you try to understand it, the more it slips away. Some people create it without trying, others try too hard and kill it instantly, and the worst part, most people don't even realize when it starts or when it disappears. They only notice it when it's already gone. So the real question is what actually makes that invisible shift happen before anything even begins. # direct hit keynote 1 ultra expanded real emotion. No repetition attraction doesn't always start with words or actions or anything obvious. Sometimes it begins in the smallest moment that nobody plans. Two people can be standing in the same space, talking normally, behaving normally, but something underneath starts shifting without either of them naming it. It can be the way someone looks at the other person for just a little longer than necessary, not in a dramatic way, just enough to be noticed on a subconscious level. Or the way a pause suddenly feels heavier than it should, like the air between them is carrying something unspoken. And in that moment, nothing has officially changed, but everything feels slightly different. The mind starts paying attention in a new way. Not because something big happened, but because something subtle broke the normal pattern. And once that pattern breaks, the interaction stops feeling purely casual. It becomes more aware, more sensitive, more charged in a way that is hard to describe. What makes it even more intense is that neither person usually talks about it. They continue the conversation like everything is normal, but internally, the awareness has already shifted. And that's where the real beginning happens, not in what is said, but in what is suddenly felt without permission. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need confirmation. It just starts existing in the background of the interaction, quietly shaping how everything else is experienced from that point onward. # direct hit keynote 2 ultra long deep emotion, simple English. No repetition. Sometimes it's not what someone says that creates a shift. It's how they react in a very small moment. A normal question can be asked, something simple, casual, nothing serious, but the reaction that follows changes everything. There's a very brief pause, a slight change in tone, a tiny hesitation that most people don't even realize they're showing. But the other person feels it, not clearly, not logically, just as a subtle difference in energy, and in that moment, the conversation stops being just conversation. The mind starts paying attention in a different way, not because something big happened, but because something felt slightly off from the usual flow. And once that feeling enters, awareness increases. Now every small detail starts getting noticed without effort, the way someone speaks, how fast they respond, how comfortable or uncomfortable they seem in their own presence. Even silence starts feeling different than before. What makes this powerful is that nothing has changed on the surface. Both people are still talking normally, still acting normal, still continuing the interaction as if everything is the same. But internally, the perception has already shifted, and perception is what controls emotional experience more than words ever do. From that point, the interaction is no longer just about what is being said. It becomes about how each moment feels while it is happening. And that feeling is very sensitive. It can grow quietly if the flow stays natural, or it can fade just as quietly if something feels forced or uncertain. Most people never notice this moment when it begins. They only feel the difference later when the energy has already changed and they can't point out exactly why. But the truth is, it always starts in these small reactions, the ones that seem too small to matter, but end up shaping everything that follows. Direct hit keynote 3, ultra long emotional flow, simple English, no repetition. Sometimes attraction doesn't change because of what is happening in the moment. It changes because of what the mind starts expecting at the beginning. Everything feels normal. Two people are talking, sharing space, and the interaction feels light and easy. But slowly, something shifts in the background that no one openly notices. It starts when one person begins to anticipate the other person's response before it even comes. Not in a planned way, but naturally, as the mind starts reading patterns. And once the mind starts predicting instead of just experiencing, the feeling of surprise begins to disappear. Without surprise, interactions start feeling controlled, predictable, almost rehearsed, even if nothing is actually rehearsed. And that predictability changes emotional intensity. Because human attention is naturally drawn to moments that feel slightly uncertain, slightly alive, slightly unpredictable in a soft way. When that element becomes weaker, the interaction still continues, but the emotional charge behind it starts reducing. It's not a sudden drop. It happens slowly in layers. A response feels a bit expected. A reaction feels a bit familiar. A moment that could have felt alive starts feeling neutral instead. And the strange part is, both people usually continue behaving the same way. Nothing dramatic happens, no argument, no change in words, but internally, the experience of the interaction starts to flatten. It no longer feels like something unfolding in real time. It starts feeling like something that is already known. And once the mind labels something as predictable, it naturally stops investing the same level of emotional attention into it. This is where people get confused later. They don't understand why the initial spark feels different now, even though nothing wrong happened. But the change was never in the surface behavior, it was always in how the mind started experiencing repetition instead of discovery. Direct hit keynote 4, ultra long emotional plus psychological flow. No repetition. Sometimes the strongest shift in attraction happens when everything looks normal on the outside, but the emotional space between two people starts to lose its contrast. At first, there is natural variety in the interaction. Moments of lightness, moments of curiosity, moments where both people are not fully predictable to each other. But slowly, that variety starts reducing. One person begins to carry the conversation too consistently in one direction. The flow becomes stable, controlled, too smooth. And when things become too smooth, the emotional edge starts disappearing. Because attraction doesn't stay alive in perfectly stable patterns. It stays alive in small changes of rhythm, in slight emotional movement, in moments that feel alive instead of mechanically steady. When that movement reduces, the interaction still continues, but it starts feeling emotionally flat. The words are still there, but the feeling behind them becomes softer, less noticeable, less intense. And what makes this even more powerful is that nobody intentionally creates this situation. It happens naturally when someone becomes too comfortable in managing the interaction instead of simply being present in it. They try to maintain everything, keep it safe, keep it stable, avoid awkwardness, avoid silence. But in doing that, they also remove the natural contrast that creates emotional tension. And without contrast, there is no rise and fall in feeling. Everything stays at the same level, and the mind doesn't hold attention strongly in something that never changes in emotional texture. So even though nothing goes wrong, the connection starts feeling less engaging over time. Not because interest disappears suddenly, but because emotional variation slowly fades out of the experience itself. Direct hit keynote 5, ultra long deep emotional flow. No repetition. Sometimes attraction doesn't end because something bad happens. It fades because nothing feels alive anymore in the way it used to. At the beginning, even small things feel meaningful. A short message, a quick reply, a simple moment of attention, everything carries a certain weight. But over time, when the interaction becomes too familiar, the emotional sensitivity starts to decrease. Not because the people change completely, but because the experience starts feeling less new. The mind naturally responds more strongly to things that feel fresh, uncertain, or slightly unpredictable. When that element slowly disappears, the emotional intensity also starts to reduce without any obvious signal. What remains is still communication, still presence, still interaction, but the feeling behind it becomes lighter. And this is where many people misunderstand what is happening. They think something is wrong or something needs to be fixed immediately. But in reality, it is not a problem that appears suddenly, it is a gradual shift in perception. A moment that once felt interesting now feels familiar. A response that once felt exciting now feels expected. A connection that once felt emotionally active now feels steady in a way that is harder to notice. And because everything still looks normal, people assume everything is still the same, but internally, the emotional response is not the same anymore. The mind has already adjusted. It no longer reacts with the same level of attention because it has already mapped the pattern. And once something becomes fully mapped in the mind, it stops creating the same emotional stimulation it once did. This is why some connections feel strong in the beginning, but slowly lose their intensity without any clear reason. It's not about one moment or one mistake. It's about the gradual loss of emotional freshness. And by the time people realize it, they are often trying to recreate something that only existed when everything still felt new and unexplored. # direct hit keynote 6, ultra long emotional plus psychological flow. No repetition, sometimes the most powerful shift in attraction, happens without any clear moment that you can point to. There is no argument, no decision, no ending point, just a slow change in how everything starts to feel. At the beginning, attention is natural. Both people are present in the moment, reacting freely, without overthinking how each word is being received. But gradually, something changes in the background of awareness. One person starts becoming more conscious of how they are being seen. They begin adjusting themselves slightly, not in a visible way, but in subtle behavior shifts. The way they speak becomes more measured. The way they respond becomes more controlled. The natural flow starts getting filtered through awareness. And once awareness replaces spontaneity, the emotional texture of the interaction begins to change. Because spontaneity carries life in it. It carries unpredictability, softness, and natural emotional movement. When that reduces, the interaction still continues, but it starts feeling more structured, more careful, less emotionally open. And the other person feels this shift without needing to analyze it, not as a thought, but as a difference in energy. The interaction still looks the same on the surface, but the feeling behind it becomes less immersive. It no longer pulls attention in the same way, and this is where most confusion begins. People assume attraction should be consistent as long as communication continues. But emotional engagement doesn't work like that. It depends on how freely someone is present in the moment, not just how much they are present physically or verbally. When presence becomes controlled instead of natural, emotional depth starts reducing without any dramatic signal. And the most interesting part is that this shift is usually only noticed later, when someone looks back and realizes the feeling was different long before anything officially changed. Because in real experience, attraction doesn't always break suddenly. Sometimes it quietly fades in the space where naturalness is slowly replaced by self-awareness.